Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. Today we're joined by Professor SherAli Tareen. I will give a brief introduction. So Professor SherAli Tareen has been teaching at Franklin Marshall College since 2012. He received his PhD in religious studies from Duke University in 2012. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early modern and modern South Asia. He has also written extensively on the interaction of Islam and secularism. His book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which I have right here, it was published in 2020, and it received the American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize and was selected as a finalist for the 2021 American Academy of Religion Book Award. And his second book, which is most recent one, it was published in August 2023, is this book, Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. A central theme in both of these books is this idea of how the ulama in colonial India or Islamic South Asia are articulating competing rationalities of Islamic tradition. Other than that, Professor is also a co-host of a podcast, and I'll share all the links below. Professor, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Irsha.
Right. Professor, I want this session to be, a resource for students because this week they're going to be reading Defending and they're going to be reading Perilous Intimacies as well. So there are a lot of very important concepts and terms in both of the books that I want students to learn. So this session is going to be basically a resource for them to learn those concepts very easily. So for example, political theology, discursive tradition, what it is, etc. So I want to begin first by asking, and I'll actually start with this book, Defending. Professor, what is a political theology, and why is it important in the colonial moment for the reformist movements that emerged in colonial India?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. First of all, thank you so much, Shersha, for this invitation. This always is my most important audience. The audiences in India, Pakistan, and Kashmir. It's really delightful to see the ways in which, since the Pakistan edition has come out of Defending Muhammad in Modernity, how it has been engaged by young scholars like yourself. And I should just note that, I'm both really admiring, but also very impressed by the range of your reading. This is incredible. This, I think, is the best kind of scenario in which, those of us who are writing in the academy, but based in the Western Academy nonetheless, although, strongly tied to South Asia, personally and intellectually, but yet residing here in the West, so to say, to see that work being read with such diligence, with such sophistication, with such closeness, is really quite delightful. And I think that is precisely what is needed. I think what you were saying before we started recording, that this gap between, or let's put it this way, the kind of sensationalized representations of religion on different parts of the ideological spectrum is something which is a great disservice to the nuance and sophistication of the Islamic intellectual tradition, especially in South Asia. So this is a very, very important forum, and I'm really honored to be here. So you asked about the category of political theology. So I think this might be the most useful way to get into this topic, which is that, when I wrote this book, it comes from my PhD dissertation, which I wrote I did my PhD between 2005 and 2012. And in that time, sort of the early 2000s, around 20 years ago or so, this category of political theology was quite in circulation, and quite a few writers were thinking about this and writing about it. And of course, many of Western philosophers, political theorists, scholars of religion, anthropology, were especially interested in engaging with the thought of this German lawyer and thinker called Carl Schmitt, who in 1922, almost exactly a century ago, published this very sort of short but also very potent book called Political Theology. And the main way in which this idea of political theology was being approached by Western scholars was to think about the ways in which contemporary or modern political institutions, primarily the modern state, are deeply indebted to languages of theology, even though those institutions and the whole narrative of liberalism is one of completely eclipsing, completely overshadowing, and completely overcoming theology, religion, etc. But in fact, the modern state and its political logic is deeply indebted to some theological logics of operation. So most paradigmatically, the example to make it very specific is that Carl Schmitt wrote at one point that all modern political concepts are basically secularized theological concepts, and none more than the whole concept of what we call sovereignty, this idea of who gets to be the sovereign, how is sovereignty decided. And for Carl Schmitt, just like in theology, the sovereign is the entity that can announce the exception to the rule, which in theological terms would be the miracle. The miracle, of course, ultimately is the exception to the rule, what in Arabic we would call kharqul aada, meaning something that is part of the aada, from which of course we get the word adat, something that is regular and normal, but then to interrupt it, exception to the norm. That would be the miracle in theology. And for the modern state, of course, the exception to the norm is to declare the emergency or declare that the normal laws are no longer operative. So the sovereign is the entity that can announce the exception. So this was basically some of the ways in which political theology as a category was being employed by Western scholars in very productive ways, in very interesting ways. To basically, in a nutshell, to give you a headline of what I've been saying is the main preoccupation of these scholars was to think about ways in which modern secular politics, in fact, is deeply theological, and to think about ways in which modern political institutions and discourses are indebted to and are analogical to theological discourses, concepts like the miracle, and so on. So in defending Mohammedan modernity, what I try to do is I try to invert that, what we might call that problem space. Whereas rather than thinking about the question of how is modern politics indebted to theology, which was the main kind of problem space, what I was interested in looking at was ways in which theological debates among Muslim scholars articulate competing conceptions of the political. So in some ways, I try to invert that problem space by not looking so much as the theology of secular politics, but rather the political rationalities, logics, aspirations at work in seemingly theological debates. So for example, the way that, in fact, I got into this whole category was that when I was writing about this debate between these two early 19th century scholars, both very prominent scholars in South Asia. One person called Shah Muhammad Ismail died in 1831, the grandson of the famous Shah Waliullah, died in 1762. So I was looking at a debate between Shah Muhammad Ismail and one of his arch nemesis called Fazl Haq Khairabadi from the Khairabadi school of thought, which of course is known for its focus on logic and philosophy. And what I was seeing in the debates between these two scholars on things like prophetic intercession, or what we call shafa'a or shafa'at, or other matters to do with theology, what I was noticing in their discourses was that implicit in their discourses were competing political projects and aspirations. Whereas for Fazl Khairabadi, when he defended something like shafa'at, the idea of there being a hierarchy in salvation, you have God, you have the prophet, then you have the Sufi masters, then you have the common people. So this hierarchical ordering of theology, even the language in which he was articulating that, was presuming the normativity or the desirability of a hierarchical political order, which for him was the political order of the Mughal Empire. You have, the king, then you have the princes, and then you have the advisors, and then you have the common people, and so on. So in the seemingly theological discourse, clearly at work was a particular kind of a political imaginary at work. And even in the examples, even the language that he was using corresponded with that. Whereas with someone like Shah Muhammad Ismail, when he argued against the idea of prophetic intercession, he clearly had a notion of the divine-human relationship, which was not hierarchical, but much more horizontal. And that, of course, was deeply connected to a new emerging political rationality that made this idea of a non-hierarchical political imaginary even thinkable in the modern moment. So this is what I was trying to do. And just to end my answer to your question, Shirsha, one of the things that, if you were to ask me what is the one major sort of take-home point, or one of the major sort of arguments that I've tried to do throughout my scholarship, is to try and argue that these seemingly, theological or Muslim legal or sometimes very idiosyncratic specialist debates, in fact, are deeply political. So in some ways, the main thrust of my work has been to try to challenge the notion that politics, this thing that we call politics, is only restricted to the modern state, is only restricted to things like liberal democracy and electoral sort of politics and so on. But to argue that, in fact, these theological debates and this question of how should Muslim communities practice their faith in everyday ritual life, basically what we would call the cultivation of ethical selves, this, in fact, is deeply political. So we cannot sort of sidestep or completely, stereotype Muslim intellectual debates and discourses as somehow disconnected with this thing called politics, which is all about the state and the law and rationality, and nothing to do with religion. But in fact, to show that, in fact, these debates and their discourses, even though they do not explicitly articulate it as such, but in fact, they carry and they articulate very complex and sophisticated understandings of politics and political theories. So that is how, in some ways, my work is a challenge to secular power, which is very adamant to keep the religious and the political separated. And in some ways, my whole scholarship is trying to critique that underlying assumption of secularism and secular power, but through the close reading of religious texts of South Asian ulama in conversation with the pre-modern Muslim intellectual tradition as well. I'll stop there.
Right, thank you. This was very insightful. Yeah, I think, Professor, you've summarized and you explained it very easily, this whole thing. Professor, what you just mentioned, it's very interesting. When you mentioned that the way that Fazl Khairabadi, when he was arguing against Shah Muhammad Ismail, when I was, almost like midway, when I was, reading about the back and forth between Shah Muhammad Ismail and Fazl Khairabadi, I was, one thing that I actually wrote that thing in the back of the book here. Here, I actually wrote it here, and I wrote it here. So written here that okay, what are the theological debates or the theological arguments that Fazl Khairabadi was articulating? Was he, influenced by his social environment that he was living in? Because he's from a aristocratic family, and you mentioned in the book that when he would go to study hadith with from the uncle of Shah Muhammad Ismail, he would have servants, with him. So there was, he was living in that, overall framework of, hierarchy, etc. So this was, I actually wrote it in the back. Okay, was he, influenced by this environment where he was living in? So this was very insightful. Professor,
Yeah.
I want to, talk about this book in the sense that this book has three parts. The first part is about competing political theologies, and the second part is
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm listening.
yeah, and the second part is competing normativities. And then the third part is about the internal debates that happen between the Deoband scholars.
Yeah.
Um, I was wondering, um, uh, the Deoband ulama, when so Qasim Zaman said in his book, The Islam in Pakistan, he says that the Deoband scholars were self-consciously reformist, because in a sense that they wanted to reform the prevailing practices and norms that were prevailing at that time. And in response to that, the Barelvi Maslak, the people from the Barelvi orientation, their identity was sort of solidified because they were responding to the reform project of the Deoband scholars. So my question is, on page 47, you mentioned that in this colonial moment, there was this rise of middle class ulama uh, that happens. Could you elaborate more on that? And can we make a connection between this rise of middle class ulama and the rise of Deoband? Like, can we say that it is because, like, is it the same thing?
No, great question, Shersha. I'll just say one more thing in response to the earlier comment you made about political theology. And I think that's a useful point to make, which is that this category of political theology is not a category of cause and effect. So it's not so much that, when political conditions change, this is what it does to theology, or when theological discourses change, this is what it does to politics. It's not so much this kind of a cause-effect relationship between politics on the one hand and theology on the other. But rather, and this is what makes this category both exciting and a bit challenging, in fact, to write about, to think about, to read about, it really is about the intimate entanglement of the theological and the political, whereby you cannot separate the cause from the effect. It's not some kind of a historicist category where you just look at political conditions and how they change, and then on the basis of that, how they might affect theological discourses. But rather, it's about the intimate entanglement of the theological and the political, how they're always entangled with each other. This is a common misreading, especially from some social historians who are very adamant to look at causative understandings of religion, which itself is a kind of a secular historicism. So I just wanted to clarify that. Now, the question that you asked, yes, certainly there is a rise of a certain set of conditions, and those set of conditions include the rise of a certain kind of a middle class ulama. And the key question here is that these debates around things like celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the Mawlid, debates on Shafa'ah, debates. Some of the debates are more specific to South Asia, such as this whole debate about distributing food to the neighborhood or to the destitute on the third day of someone's death, what we call Siwam um, Teja in some colonial North Indian contexts. Uh, but all of these debates basically become so intensified, basically become so much part of the public discourse at this particular historical moment. I mean, this was one of the main questions that I had to address, which is why do these debates become so intensified precisely in the uh, duration of the 19th century? Of course, these debates have a much longer history, both in South Asia and outside of South Asia. But the one thing which is exceptional, one thing which is very different about the 19th century is the volume of these debates, the intensity of these debates, and how some of these questions and their debate basically becomes thinkable as a prominent part of the public sphere. Whereas these debates mostly were restricted to the elite scholarly class in the pre-modern period. And one of the reasons is precisely that, scholars like the Deoband ulama find a whole new kind of audience with things like the printing press, with things like the railways and other technologies of the colonial state, uh, which enables them to reach a much larger audience. And that, in some ways, also then precipitates the backlash from their opponents, like the Barelvi scholars, etc., who also are very good at using these technologies to reach a particular kind of clientele. So you're absolutely right that the rise of a certain middle class and a rise of a certain kind of religious public, a Muslim public, which is much more clearly defined as a public, which is an object of interest for both of these schools of ulama, has a lot to do with the intensification of these debates. But we can get into the logics of the debates if you want to, but I just wanted to very specifically answer the question you asked.
Right. First of all, I want you to elaborate that point more when you said that there was this rise in polemical debates and religious.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be right to say that there was a rise in religious hostility in colonial moment. But on page 70, I've marked it here. You've written here. It says that the colonial evacuation of religion as a distinct and particular domain of life so that it could be managed and protected by the state had the paradoxical effect of rendering that domain even more conflictual, polemical, and competitive. And then you
Yeah.
write more. You said that the more one seeks to define and limit a category, in this case religion, the more avidly its definition and limits will be contested. It is not a coincidence that the 19th century was a moment of unprecedented intra-religious and inter-religious adversarial activity in South Asia. So, Professor, with regards to this quote, I had a question. Um,
Yep.
one of the things that happens in colonial India is that the Sharia is codified, right? So Al-Hidayah by Al-Marghirani, it was codified, and Sharia before that, in before pre-colonial times, it was sort of considered as an activity, as an a creative activity. But in colonial moment, it becomes a content, and that's something that Qasim Zaman says in the Ulama and Contemporary Islam.
Right.
So, Professor, could you elaborate more, like how does the homogenization or codification of in the legal domain, for example, or how does the homogenization of religious identities lead to more debates and adversarial activities that you have written?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I'll say two things in response to that question. The first thing I will say is, one of the main themes of the first book, Defending Mohammedan Modernity, is this simultaneous development of two phenomena. On the one hand, you have the phenomenon that a lot of these intra-Muslim South Asian debates, or I should say South Asian Muslim intellectual debates, that used to happen among individual Muslim scholars, even at the moment of the early 19th century. For example, the whole debate between Shah Muhammad Ismail and Fazl Khairabadi. So notice that these debates that usually would happen between individual Muslim scholars, they take on a much more group-centered orientation and identity by the late 19th century, with the rise of these masalik or singular maslak, these kind of reform movements or normative orientations, primarily the Deoband, the Barelvi, and the Ahl Hadith, in addition to other movements that develop at this time, Aligarh, of course, and others. So I was really interested in the question of this group-centered orientation that gets developed in the late 19th century. This in some ways happens parallel to, simultaneous with, the entrenchment, the solidification of British colonial power, especially in the moment after 1857, when Indian Muslims are brutally defeated in the War of Rebellion. So this is not coincidental that the two things are happening simultaneously, that as colonial power and as the juggernaut of the colonial state becomes more and more entrenched, especially in northern India, we see a simultaneous entrenchment of the group-centered nature of these intra-Muslim debates. They take on a group-centered orientation. And connecting that to now my second point, and that really is about what you were just talking about, which is that, the colonial state comes in the post-1857 moment with this classic secular principle that, all religious groups and movements and people are free to do what they want to do as far as their worship is concerned, as far as the practice of their religion is concerned, as long as they don't interrupt, as long as they don't interfere with the political sovereignty, the political operations of the colonial state. So this is a classic secular kind of conception of evacuating the sphere of religious passions, religious debate, religious practice on the one hand, and separating it from the sphere of politics, law, the sphere of quote-unquote rationality on the other. But this has the paradoxical effect, and the paradoxical effect is that the more you limit a domain of life, in this case, limiting a domain of life called religion, religious passions, religious debates, the more that domain will become competitive. And that is basically why you see not only among South Asian Muslims the emergence of these competitive groups, but also in other religious traditions. You have the division in Hinduism between the Arya Samaj that develops at this time and the Sanatan Dharmis. You have in Sikhism the Singh Sabha and their antagonists. So this is kind of a phenomenon that we see in all religious traditions. And then, of course, you also have the looming presence of British missionaries. And it's fascinating to realize that there are two planes of competitiveness that are happening in the late 19th century. On the one hand, there are the intra-Muslim debates and competition between, Deobandis, Barelvis, Ahl Hadith, Aligarh, and of course, throw in the Ahmadis in the mix as well. And on the other hand, you have these inter-religious debates that are happening, between the Arya Samaj and the Muslim groups and the Singh Sabha and their antagonists. So intra and inter-religious debates are happening at the same time. Now, the final point I would make, and connected to what you said about the Sharia, is that, and this is a conceptual point, which I think will be useful for the participants of the seminar, a conceptual point beyond the specifics of South Asian ulama or their debates and so on. The conceptual point is this, or let me say the conceptual question is this. How do we think about and how do we theorize the relationship between colonial power and conditions on the one hand, and Muslim intellectual, thought and debates or discourse on the other? And the thing to realize here is that with things like, as you said, the codification of the Sharia and the canonization, of the Anglo-Mohammedan law and those kinds of things, that, Muslim scholars were involved in that process, certainly. But the rules of engagement, how those texts like Al-Hidayah are going to be canonized, how they will be translated into English and put to use in the courts, those kinds of questions are ultimately decided by the British state. So there is a lopsided and uneven power relation that is happening, whereby indigenous scholars like Muslim scholars, participate quite fervently in these processes of, thinking about the Sharia, these debates, and so on. But they have to constantly contend with a terrain, with a field of politics, knowledge production, technologies. That terrain and that field is one which is not of their own making or choosing. So there is this kind of debate in the academy about, how do we think about the relationship between British colonial power and these indigenous scholars, whether they're Muslim scholars, Hindu scholars, Sikh scholars. And there is this kind of a fashionable trend to, say that, no, 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 it's not all colonial power because, these native scholars, these indigenous scholars also participate in these things and we are robbing them of their agency if we just talk about colonial power as being completely, determinative of what is happening. The problem with this whole giving the native her agency back, this kind of imputing agency to the native narrative, is that it does not think more carefully about ways in which power, which is derived from new conditions like technology, like the idea that the modern state is now at the center of politics, these are new ideas of modernity. How the power which is invested in these new conditions determines the very terrain, the very field in which these Muslim scholars now are obliged and bound to operate in. So one does not have to undermine the creativity, the ferventness, the tremendous, intellectual sophistication of the scholars. And in some ways, that is what scholarship is all about, trying to bring out these layers of ambiguity, sophistication in South Asian ulama. But that should not lead us to undermine the significance of the new terrain that they now have to negotiate. And that is something that becomes more and more the case as the 19th century progresses. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, there are like 2, 3 ways that I want to go, but first I want to stick to what you said about the British colonial power. I want to contrast it with its predecessor, the Mughal Empire.
Yeah.
So in the first chapter, thinking the question of sovereignty in early colonial India, you make the distinction between state subsidiarity and state subsumption. So my question is, if this was how the British interacted with the people that they came to rule, how did the Mughal Empire came to, like, how were they ruling these things, and why did these reform movements and did not emerge in that time, and why did this rise in polemics did not happen in Mughal India?
Yeah, I mean, this is, Shersha, as you know, a question of tremendous debate among scholars of South Asia. This whole debate between what we might call continuity and rupture, this shift from Mughal sovereignty to British colonial government, to what extent are there continuities and what are the ruptures and what are more important or significant or dominant? It's an ongoing debate. My position basically on this debate is that there are both continuities and ruptures, but the ruptures I think are more significant. That basically would be a summation of my position here. And a great way to see that is the example that I give in chapter 1, drawing on the work of scholars like Bernard Cohn, who was a very famous and important historical anthropologist of South Asia. And I think he argues very convincingly that some of the rituals through which the state interacts with the community or different parts of the community um, continue or transfer from Mughal Empire to the British colonial state, and this whole idea of uh, the people in a community, going up to the Mughal king or the sovereign and offering things like cloaks or other kinds of sort of gold or coins, whatever, and that basically offering becomes a way in which the kind of embodied relationship between the state or the governing elite and the community becomes established. And Bernard Cohn shows that this ritual continues. This ritual that used to happen at Mughal courts, the Mughal Darbar, continues in the British colonial period as well. But this kind of embodied logic that this exchange is one that becomes the site of some kind of an embodied intimacy between the governing elite and the community is taken to mean in purely sort of economic or purely material terms as a kind of exchange of different items rather than, and loses its kind of a spiritual embodied meaning. So that is one thing. And the other thing to realize is that, and this basically gets to the crux of the distinction, is that this idea that you have a centralized state which is a representative of and which mirrors the sovereign will of the people is a thoroughly new and modern idea. So, the Mughal state, of course, had its own mechanisms of, spying or gathering intelligence or knowing more about the communities over which it was ruling. But the sophistication and the power and the reach of the British colonial state on its, indigenous populations was much greater than what was the case with the Mughal Empire. So it's a much more powerful state. It is much more invested in new things like the census, where people go door to door, collect information on what religion are you, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, your ethnicity, your caste, and those kinds of things. So, these things are very powerful ways of governance, the kind of ways in which they make possible the governmentality of the state, and just the reach, the power, the kind of intrusiveness of the state in terms of managing and administering their rule over the population is much more dramatic and much more pronounced in the case of British colonial empire compared to the Mughal Empire. So there are continuities, but I think the ruptures are a lot more significant, especially in relation to the transformation of religious identities in South Asia.
Professor, I want to, there are like obviously two more questions about defending, and then I want to move on to perilous.
Sure.
So, and this is about Shah Muhammad Ismail and his reform project. So, Professor, I think on page 167, if I'm not wrong, you make this distinction between political intervention and epistemological or epistemic intervention. And you've said in the book that there were various reform movements, like for example the modernist Aligarh movement, right? So Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and the other early modernists. They were well versed in, let's say, Western sciences in easy terms. But someone like Shah Muhammad Ismail, even though he was, in that context of political crisis or this context of, colonial moment, so this is the political intervention. But Shah Muhammad Ismail was not responding to, the Western sciences because he was not well aware of it. He was only he articulated his reform project because of that, political intervention, because of the British colonial rule. Can you elaborate more on this distinction between political and epistemic intervention, and also the different varied reform movements that emerged? And why is it important to make that distinction? Like, why is it important to say that we should not categorize all of them as just one entity into one category?
No, that's excellent question again, Shirsha. The importance of your question lies in the critical importance of being very specific when we make arguments about, again, the theme of the relationship between colonial power and Muslim intellectual discourses and logics of arguing about the tradition and so on. There can be a tendency sometimes to make very grand narratives, to say that, for example, a thinker like Shah Muhammad Ismail is critiquing things like prophetic intercession, is critiquing things like people going to the shrines of saints, is critiquing superstitious customs and so on. So it can be tempting to look at a figure like him and say, oh, this is textbook, colonial Protestant Islam that is critical of hierarchies, that is critical of the supernatural, that is critical of superstitious customs. It is really arguing for divine sovereignty and its absoluteness. This basically is a Muslim version of a Protestant kind of logic. And what that kind of a framing would miss out is that, Shah Muhammad Ismail is drawing equally from the Muslim intellectual tradition itself, as his reservoirs of knowledge that he's drawing from is not some kind of a, Protestant set of text, but rather it is coming from the tradition itself. And it is on that basis that I sort of proffered that distinction that might be helpful when we think about a figure like him, that clearly his thought and his reception and the reach that he has among Indian Muslims, both during his life and after, clearly it is made possible by some new conditions, like the printing press, like these things becoming more contested in the public sphere, like Mughal sovereignty being uncertain and shifting from one sovereign entity to another, from the Mughal to the British. So this uncertainty about political sovereignty clearly facilitates, clearly makes possible the career and the thought of a scholar like Shah Muhammad Ismail. So clearly his thought is indebted to the newly emerging colonial conditions and categories and technologies. But at the same time, we cannot frame him as some kind of a Muslim Protestant figure, because he is drawing equally from the Islamic intellectual tradition itself as well. And he was, as you mentioned, not trained in British schools or some kind of colleges and so on. That is the case with some Muslim modernists that come later in the late 19th century. So basically, Shershah, it is an argument for specificity. You asked me why it is important to distinguish then between these two things. On the one hand, the new technological, the new political conditions of colonial modernity, and then on the other hand, the epistemological sort of logics. Epistemological basically is a fancy way of saying the things that inform what you know, the things that inform your worldview, your knowledge. So these questions of knowledge cannot be just reduced to British colonial power, because he's drawing from an Islamic tradition. Uh, and the same Shah Muhammad Ismail, I think that's also worthy of noticing here or mentioning here, that the same Shah Muhammad Ismail, who is very, very polemical, who's very firebrand, in a text of his, like this famous Urdu text of his called Taqwiyatul Iman, written in 1826, which is his most famous book, in which he goes after all these rituals and practices and so on. But he's the same Shah Muhammad Ismail. When he writes in Persian, he writes a really sophisticated and a very difficult text, which was not meant for the common people, called Mansab-e Imamat, or the station of leadership, that he writes in Persian. So the same scholar can switch in different modes as well. So we can't frame him in this kind of a generalized fashion. So the reason why that distinction that I make between the political and the institutional and the technological conditions of colonial modernity on the one hand, and the epistemological conditions on the other, is precisely so that we can be more specific about this encounter between British colonialism and Muslim intellectual traditions and debates, and to be specific that Shah Muhammad Ismail is not the same as a Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who establishes Aligarh and so on. Then, who is yet not the same as someone like Maududi, who is yet not the same as someone like Ashraf Ali Thanvi. So really, one needs to be very specific about these thinkers, their texts, their logics, rather than coming up with some kind of grand narratives of this relationship between colonial power and Muslim intellectual traditions in South Asia.
Right. Professor, the part two of the book, Defending, is competing normativities.
Yeah.
And there is, so on page 258, there is a subsection called Competing Logics and Tradition. Competing Logics of Time and Tradition. So basically, on page 261, you briefly explain how the Deoband scholars understood, a normative practice. So their argument basically is that, well, the first three generation, what we call Salafus Salihin, they basically have this normative function of sanctioning law, and also sanctioning law and also establishing what a normative practice looks like. So basically, they will provide you with this template of what a normative practice look like, and the later generations only have to emulate that, only have to imitate that. Um, and of course, the perspective of Ahmed Raza Khan Barelvi is very different. He says that goodness is not just limited to a particular moment, a particular time. It's actually it's not limited. So I want you to just briefly explain, because students will be reading this part two as well.
Uh-huh.
So if you could explain what normative practice means, like this concept is strong, and how the Deoband and Barelvi articulated different understanding of competing normatives.
Yeah, Shersha, just take a step back. One of the things that, as you will read, that I'm very interested in doing in this book is that, although previous scholars have also challenged this notion, which is a very dominant notion when it comes to the whole Barelvi-Deobandi debate, not only in Western context, but even in South Asia for that matter, especially among certain kind of a liberal secular class, is to think about this debate primarily as one between legal reformers and Sufi mystics, or between Sufism and law. Um, and I really wanted to once and for all challenge and undermine this kind of an easy framing of this very sophisticated intellectual debate. And the way I try to do that precisely is to look at some of the other logics which are at work in this debate. And among other things, one of the things that animates this debate is competing notions of the relationship between time and tradition. And there, basically, the idea is that for the Deoband school, or the pioneers of the Deoband school, I should say, people like Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, died in 1943, perhaps the most prolific Deoband scholar. For people like Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, the main concern that he had was with the idea that there are some customs and rituals in everyday Muslim ritual life in South Asia which have become so dominant in the religious lives of the common people that their underlying purpose and their underlying logics have become lost on the people, and they are only committed to the form of those rituals, the external forms, rather than the inner meaning, rather than the purpose, rather than the history, or the main kind of logics behind them have been lost, and only the form remains. And this kind of a critique that he had about, intervening in the religious and ritual lives of the community to sort of shake them up and to remind them about the significance of the logics behind particular rituals, was connected to a larger legal and theological argument of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi. And that theological and legal argument is that, in Islamic law, as you know, practices are categorized according to 5 different values. Is a practice forbidden or haram? Is it obligatory? Then the middle value in which most human practices fall, of course, is this value called mubah, or that which is simply permissible. So these practices, like the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, distributing food to the poor on the 3rd day of someone's death, these kinds of rituals basically are this middle category, mubah, permissible, neither obligatory nor forbidden. And Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi's concern was that people have become so attached to the external forms of these rituals. And that's a very key part of his logic and his argument. The external forms of these rituals, people have become so attached to them that, on the 3rd day of someone's death, this is the food which will be cooked. On the 3rd day of someone's death, you will have to raise your hand in front of the food and say the Fatiha. These are the people who will be invited. Or on the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, it has to be held on the 12th of Rabiul Awwal, no other date. It has to be done in terms of distributing sweets and other things to the community. The venue has to be, decorated in a particular way. So basically, Maulana Thanvi's whole argument was that these external forms have become so much part of the disciplined life of the community, they have begun to simulate, that they have begun to look like religious obligations, like praying, like fasting, etc. So the regularity of these practices have taken on the aura of religious obligations. And hence, this distinction that God has instituted between the obligatory practices and the simply permissible, that distinction is being challenged, is being confused. And for someone like Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, this is perhaps even more dangerous than outright sins, than outright, things which are outright forbidden, like murder and so on, because people are doing these practices thinking they're doing well, thinking that they're doing good practices, when in fact they're challenging the boundaries between these values that have been instituted by God. So, coming back to time and tradition, then, what is at work here is a notion that the practice of the common people has become completely corrupted. So time for them, time in the present moment has become completely corrupted. And their job then as reformers was to intervene in this corrupted time in order to transform it, in order to shake up the masses and tell them about their reminder, give them a reminder to think about the morality of their practices. So this basically is the kind of notion of time and tradition at work here, a corrupted time being transformed, being reformed, being purified so that the purity of the tradition can be restored. And the purity of the tradition will only be restored when the uh, uh, sovereignty of God, which is articulated through these legal values of the ahkam, is again restored. So that's how basically theology, law, and everyday ritual practice corresponds in the thought of Deoband scholars. And for someone like Ahmed Raza Khan, his main disagreement with Deoband scholars was, why do you think about time in such negative ways? Why do you have this kind of a rise and fall model of Muslim history, whereby there was this kind of a golden moment of the first 3 centuries, and then everything has been basically declining since then? Um, and in counter distinction to this kind of a notion of time, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan died 1921. His main idea was that, yes, the first 3 centuries, or I should say the first 3 generations, al-Qurun al-Thalatha, they are sacrosanct, they are very sacred. But that does not mean that everyone who came after that is somehow mired in the quagmire of moral corruption either. And to make this point about why there is no this kind of bifurcation between the original sacred time and then everything else after that being completely mired in corruption or going in this kind of a declining pattern. Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan was very fond of quoting this hadith that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once said that my community is like rain shower. My community is like rain shower. You cannot tell whether the beginning of a rain shower is better or its end. مثل أمتي مثل المطر لا يدرى أوله خير أم آخره. So for Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, this is the final thing I will say here, and it's a very important point, and I show this, of course, in the latter part of the book as well, that Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, it's not as if he is not concerned about the conduct and the practice of the masses. He's also deeply critical of them, and in some instances, even more critical than the Deoband ulama. And I show these examples of how they converge in this one chapter called Convergences. I think it was chapter 10, I believe, of the book. So he's also very critical of the masses. But his main argument is, and it's a very subtle technical disagreement, his main argument is that if the masses have brought some kind of corruption to otherwise permissible practices in terms of the form that they're very attached to, or that they're spending too much money in terms of giving food to the poor on the third day of someone's death, or they're doing it just for affectation or to show off their wealth and so on, bad intentions. So if there are certain corruptions which have entered into these practices, the job of the ulama should be to reform the corruptions that have come into it, not to completely excise, not to completely ban, not to completely call heretical innovations or bid'ah these very practices like the Mawlid, like these other practices, and so on. So this was a very subtle disagreement that Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan had, that you cannot completely ban those practices on the pretext of saying that they've become morally corrupted. But rather, what you do is you educate the masses, you do the pedagogy, and you to remove the moral corruptions that have come into these practices, rather than completely banning them or calling them heretical innovations. So this is a very subtle disagreement between these two groups of scholars. And the main sort of technical thing they're disagreeing on is, to end my answer to your question, Sher Shah, the main thing they're disagreeing on is that if certain corruptions become attached to simply permissible practices, these mubah practices, what should the scholars do? For the Deoband scholars, the situation had reached an emergency point. People were so mired in moral corruptions that the only viable option was to cut the means to these practices. So there is this kind of a legal doctrine called daraya, or blocking the means to any kind of moral corruption. Whereas for Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, he was also concerned about the masses and their practices. The answer to the challenge was not to cut these practices or block the means to these practices, which were a means to exalt the Prophet, exalt other, saints and so on, but to cleanse the practices of their moral corruptions. So this is a very, very subtle disagreement between two equally sophisticated groups of Muslim scholars. And when we frame this kind of a debate as, legal scholars and Sufi scholars, or good Muslims and bad Muslims, basically what we're doing is we're robbing this tradition and its nuanced logics of their sophistication. And we're engaging in this kind of a caricature of religion, of religious scholars, for the benefit of liberal secular mockery. And that is basically what I really wanted to show here, was that there are some very complicated logics of life at work here. There are two competing conceptions of tradition and time, two competing conceptions of the idea of religious authority of Muslim scholars and what they should do in terms of uh, uh, caring for the masses, two competing political theories at work. So I really wanted to bring out the sophistication of these internal logics rather than dismissing them simply as some kind of debate between legal and mystical scholars.
Right. Thank you, Professor. This was very insightful. I want to be first. I want to be mindful of the time. How much time do you have for this
Maybe a
session?
half an hour more. I can go half an hour more. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Right. Because some student, there are 2, 3 students have questions as well, and they
Okay.
would like
I'll
to
be
ask.
I'll be brief. No, I'll be brief. I'll be brief. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I have a list of like long list of questions that I want to ask you about. But Professor, I'll ask this last. Maybe I think I should move on to this book, and then we
Okay.
can move on to Q&A.
Sure.
So Professor, in this book, Perilous Intimacies, first of all, Professor, will this be available in Pakistan anytime soon for the students?
Folio Press that did the Defending Muhammad book, they've promised that they will do this one as well. I just need to remind them, and hopefully by the end of this year, I'll push for that. So hopefully, inshallah, by the end of this year.
Yeah, perfect. Because this book will be really helpful if students read it. Because this is really these two books really like opened my eyes in terms of like understanding the landscape, religious landscape of colonial India from 18th and 20th century. So,
Which
Professor,
which which which, which one is better, do you think?
oh, I would say this one. Perilous is really
Yes, great.
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really, I've read this book 4 times, but this one like
Wow,
twice.
even I haven't. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
No, I
So,
agree with your assessment because it's a work of a more an
yeah.
older author. So yes, go on. Please go on. Yeah.
Because Professor, in this book, I think that the books gets very specific at times, and for me, and as a beginner student, there was one chapter, I don't know which one was it. Oh, law, sovereignty, and the boundaries of normative practice. I had to struggle myself to finish that chapter because it was so long and there were so many concepts that I had to understand. But this book was like a treat. I had so much fun reading it. It was like watching a movie or something, and the way that you were shifting the whole narrative and the way that you explained the whole landscape was really, really fun.
Thank you,
But
Shahid. Yes.
yeah, but Professor, so in this book is
Yeah.
about how ulama
Yeah.
are articulating, they are debating on the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship. And this is again the common theme between defending and perilous is that there is this colonial moment that has emerged, and this is
Yeah.
leading to the various debates. Professor, one short question that I want to ask is that so Shah Muhammad Ismail is not well versed in the Western sciences, but in that debate between Qasim Nanotvi and the Hindu scholar, and then there's this priest.
Yeah.
Which one thing very interesting was that when that priest supposedly complains that Qasim Nanotvi is relying too much on logic in
Mhm.
that debate. It's very interesting.
Right.
But first, I
Right.
want to ask: Is can you say that Qasim Nanotvi is responding to that epistemic intervention of the West, of the British colonizers, because he's using the argument of aligning the Quran with science, or saying that Quran
Yeah.
has that
Yeah.
scientific basis. So can we say that Qasim Nanotvi is responding to that epistemic intervention?
That's a great question, Shirsha. So Shersha is talking about one of the chapters in the second book, which basically is that chapter is about this interreligious polemical festival that happens in 1875 and 1876, in which you have the founder of the Deoband Madrasa, Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, died in 1877, and the founder of the Arya Samaj, Dayananda Saraswati, I believe, died in 1883, if I'm not mistaken. And some Christian missionaries debate different aspects of religion for 4 days each for 2 consecutive years. And the question that Shirsha is asking here is that in that debate, one of the things that gets debated most intensively is the question of prophetic miracles and the question of whose miracles are most miraculous. So all of these traditions go after each other about, that miracles in their tradition are the most miraculous and so on. And Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, while arguing for the superiority of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, miracles over the miracles of other prophets, Jesus, Moses, Noah, and so on, tries to show that Prophet Muhammad's miracles are the most scientifically impossible. Such as, for example, splitting the moon in half, Shaqul Qamar, as it's called, or Shaqaqul Qamar, that's mentioned in the Quran as well. So his, just one example that he basically argues that for something to split in half is much more miraculous and scientifically improbable. As, for example, keeping the sun stationary, which is Prophet Yusha alayhi salam's miracle, or even bringing the dead back to life, because at the end of the day, the dead body had a relationship with the human soul. And many other examples. And what Shirsha is asking me here is that, when Qasim Nanotwi frames his argument in the language that these miracles are the most scientifically improbable, so what do I make of that? Why is he drawing on the language of modern science? Is he more well-versed in modern science than someone like Shah Muhammad Ismail, who lived, 5 decades ago, in fact, not that long ago, but in the early 19th century? My answer to your question, Shirsha, would be that by the late 19th century, 1875, 1876, when Maulana Qasim Nanotwi is engaging in this debate, the notion that you make your moral arguments convincing through the arsenal of modern science, through the weaponry of modern science, is something which becomes much more in circulation, is something which becomes much more part of how you make your arguments than it was in the early 19th century. That, I think, is the main distinction here. I mean, someone like Qasim Nanotwi, of course, is familiar with the landscape of British colonial institutions and so on. But of course, he does not get trained in Western colleges as much. But he's much more aware of these notions of science, etc., which are percolating in Delhi and northern India in the late 19th century, much more intensively than in the early 19th century. And then it's an interesting contrast that you can then make, although this chapter doesn't talk about this figure, but if you compare someone like Qasim Nanotwi with someone like Sayyid Ahmed Khan then becomes someone who is in fact much more, invested in aligning his religious thought with Western scientific knowledge and precepts and so on. And that's precisely why Sayyid Ahmed Khan goes on to argue against the very possibility of supernatural miracles in Islam, because he cannot justify that through the language of modern science. And he famously, of course, says that if any verse in the Quran, this is Sayyid Ahmad Khan, by the way, if any verse in the Quran opposes the laws of nature, qanun-e-fitrat, then either we have misinterpreted that Quranic verse or we have not properly understood nature. Both cannot be the case. Can be no incompatibility between nature and revelation, which is why he was then called a naturist or a naturalist in a derogatory fashion, etc. So my very specific answer to your question, Shirsha, would be that someone like Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, though he is not invested in the same degree as the Sayyid Ahmad Khan in making his arguments align with modern scientific knowledge, but nonetheless, he is feeling the pressure of that colonial condition. Another good example of a colonial condition, right? This idea that the way you make your argument convincing is through the language of modern science. This is a very new way of arguing your position. This would have not made much sense even a century ago, that you argue for the superiority of Prophet Muhammad's miracles through the language of modern science. So here clearly we see a new set of conditions, a new set of how you make arguments to begin with emerging, which are then informing the discourse of a Muslim scholar who's very sophisticated, who's very well versed in his own tradition, but nonetheless is feeling the pressure of framing his arguments in a manner that would seem convincing according to the language of modern science. That's what I would say.
First, another, I would say, a common theme that I noticed while reading this book is that, on page 235, there is a very interesting quote that I want to read. So written here that Modernists and Traditionalists are useful heuristic categories that capture the alignment of varied thought styles in Islam, but the limits of these categories are often exposed and frustrated by the nuance and complexity embodied by the thought of multivalent scholars like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, or for that matter, any of the actors discussed in this book. So, and this is very similar to defending when you disrupt this binary of inclusivist, exclusivist, or legal, mystical, that thing. Professor,
Yeah.
is it like still like a tendency? Because I was, it was a surprise for me when I read it that there is this, tendency, or there is this binary that exists where people categorize the Barelvi, people from Barelvi rotation as mystical, and the Deoband as more like legal oriented. So is it
Yeah.
like still prevalent in like today's understand like in the public or in academia, where some people are categorized as moderate or inclusivist and the others as exclusivist? And why is it so? Why is it important to disrupt these binaries that exist?
Shersha, you talked about two different kinds of, sets of categories rather. The one that you just talked about, the moderate and the extremist. I mean, no student or scholar with, even a sliver of some kind of conceptual training in terms of how to think about religion and Muslim scholars and actors would use those categories because they're deeply problematic. But of course, they're very much in circulation when it comes to the media. And they're very much in circulation even in some other fields, like, for example, empiricist political science or these international relations or security studies and so on. It's quite common for people to talk about the moderate and the extremist and so on. And the main thing that they don't realize when using these kinds of categories is who will get to define what is the moderate and how to distinguish the moderate from the extremist. And of course, the idea of moderate etymology is from the idea of moderare, which is to control, to tame, to domesticate something, to regulate something. Um, and oftentimes, the criteria that you use to define the moderate is the criteria of that which is closest to modern Protestant notions of what is good religion and what is a good Muslim. So these are very deeply problematic categories, the moderate and the extremist. And the last thing I would say about this one is that sometimes people then counter argue and say, oh, even in Islam you have categories for the moderate. You have ummah wasatiyya, or this whole idea of i'tidal in Arabic and in Urdu, or in Persian you have this whole idea of mayana ravi, that these are all ideas of moderation as well. And the main thing that people miss when they try to translate these words of i'tidal, mu'tadil, mayana ravi, ummah wasatiyya as moderate is that all these Muslim categories, in fact, the underlying notion is justice, is balance individually and as a society, which will lead to justice. It is not about distinguishing between the moderates and the extremists, where the extremist is the subject who is quote unquote more religious, right? So these are very sort of secular binaries which have to be challenged. The second set of categories that you talked about, the modernist and traditionalist, there things get a bit more interesting. Things get a bit more ambiguous. Now, obviously, to think of Muslim scholars as either modernist or traditionalist is problematic because, ultimately these exemplary modernist scholars like uh, uh, Rashid Rida or Muhammad Abdu or in South Asia, Sayyid Ahmed Khan or Abul Kalam Azad, they actually were quite well trained in ulama discourses, knowledge traditions, and that's why they were seen with a lot of contempt or suspicion by the ulama class themselves. So they were very familiar with ulama knowledge traditions, madrasas, institutions, and so on. So in that way, uh, many modernists have traditionalist kind of knowledge familiarity. And then many so-called traditionalists or the ulama also, of course, have been very adept at and very skillful at using the conditions of modernity. We were just talking about it, using the language of modern science, using the printing press. Maulana Qasim Nanotwi openly said that Deoband graduates should learn English if that helps them in terms of navigating the colonial public sphere. So, they also are very much adept and skillful at using the conditions of modernity. So then the question emerges, why do we need those two categories, modernist and traditionalist? My main position on these two categories is that though one should always be very mindful to not treat this as a binary, but nonetheless, they are helpful categories because they do index, they do point to two different, one might call it, procedures and aesthetics of engaging the tradition. For the traditionalist class, and that would be the Deoband ulama, the Barelvi scholars, and so on, to make things very clear for your participants, when you use the word traditionalist in the Western Academy, basically what you mean is the ulama class. Those who have gone to a madrasa and gotten their training and come out with, a madrasa degree, they are the traditionalists, the ulama, the graduates of the madrasa life forms. And the modernists are basically those people who may have been traditionalists at one point, but then became very critical of their own tradition, or basically the idea of at the center for the modernists is a project of establishing the compatibility between Islam and the conditions of modernity. That's modernism. So my main position is that these two categories are helpful because the very way in which these scholars engage with the tradition can be quite different, can be quite distinct. And to make it very, very sort of brief and simple, the main difference here is that ulama, of course, can have very different positions on matters. They're very diverse positions. They're very flexible in terms of engaging in different ethical and moral debates. So there is no such thing as some kind of monolithic or rigid notion of traditionalism, even though that is the stereotype about them. But nonetheless, there are certain principles. There are certain what we might call epistemological priorities that, though are open to multiple interpretations, flexibility, and so on, or interpretive ingenuity and so on, they are not available for complete discarding. They're not available for such a transformative reorientation that they basically become unrecognizable. So for them, there's a lot of flexibility, but you have to engage with the tradition through the protocols of the legal schools, the four legal schools in Sunni Islam, of course, or the legal school in Shia Islam. You have to go through the legal schools and their canons to make a moral argument. You cannot bypass the logics and the canon of the legal schools. Whereas for the modernists, the legal schools are sacrosanct. It's not like Sayyid Ahmed Khan was, being abusive towards or offensive towards Abu Hanifa or any of the other sort of eponymous founders of legal schools. But for the modernists, nonetheless, the legal schools are sacrosanct, but the interpretive fidelity that you have to maintain with them is not something which is absolute. You can bypass them in making certain arguments. You don't have to be limited to the canon in making your arguments. I should say not limited, but you do not need to prioritize the canon when making your arguments. Whereas for the traditionalists, the canon holds priority, even if you're very sort of flexible and so on, but the canon holds priority and you cannot bypass it. So in that way, I think these categories are helpful because they do point to a very different or competing ways of or protocols of engaging with a tradition.
Right. This was insightful. Thank you, Professor. Professor, I want to ask this last question, and then we can move on to the Q&A.
Sure.
Although I have lots of questions that I prepared about other topics,
we'll do it again. Absolutely.
Yeah, inshallah. Professor, why is defending the book, Defending Modern Modernity? That book is very, like I said before, it's sometimes it is very specific. The book is the first comprehensive study about the Deoband-Barelvi polemic.
Yeah.
One might ask that why is it important, especially for people in South Asia or Pakistan, India, why is it important for the public or the let's say analysts to understand these debates the way that you have described them in the book? Why is it important? What would be your answer to that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Shersha. I think the way I would respond to your question is, there are two reasons why it's very important. One is that this is part of our heritage, regardless of what relationship we have to religion. This is a part of the South Asian heritage and a very critical and important part of the heritage. And just to have some kind of basic proficiency and competence in it would be very useful, regardless of what you think about the ulama, what you think about religion, Islam, whatever your own position might be. But just as a sort of contemporary subject based in South Asia, having some kind of competence and proficiency in your own heritage and traditions can only be helpful, cannot be detracting. Second is, that this is a very important way or an avenue to decolonize your identity. Because ultimately, when you say things like, oh, these are basically backward, quote unquote, mullahs, and they don't know what they're talking about, and why are they debating things like Maulid, and can you raise your hand in front of food on the third day of someone's death? They had too much time on their hands. These things have nothing to do with our own lives. Our lives are all about, science and math and, and so on. Basically, this whole kind of colonial narrative about what is quote unquote useful knowledge and what is quote unquote knowledge that is not useful. To really decolonize your identity, you have to think about Islam and the question of religion in more sophisticated ways. Because at the heart of the colonial project, at the heart of the whole notion of colonial politics is to establish Islam as the opposite or as the other of the political. This is at the heart of the very political and epistemological project of colonialism in South Asia or elsewhere, but especially in South Asia. So if you want to think about this idea of decolonizing your identity, that is impossible without a critique of the secular. There can be no possibility of a decolonial politics that does not include a critique of secular power. Because foundational to the very logic of colonialism is the secular principle, the secular assumption that religion, especially Islam, is the opposite and the other of the political. So by looking at ways in which these thinkers and their thought does put forward and does present competing visions and notions of the political, regardless of whether you agree with those notions or not, regardless of what your relationship to them might be, you are then participating in disrupting the power and the entrenchment and the normalization of the secular notion that Islam is the other of the political. So that would be the second very important reason that I think these things have to be taken seriously. And to not kind of jump to the conclusion that a set of discourses on religion will ultimately be something which have nothing to do with politics or nothing to do with things which are actually useful in the contemporary world. So that's the second reason. The third reason that I would now say, and this here I would be more speaking about the ulama themselves, or the religious class, or people who are connected in some ways to religious scholarship even today. I think for them, this debate, this 19th century debate, is very instructive because it is talking about some very, very sensitive issues. Can God create a second Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or not? Can God lie or not? Imkan-e Kizb, as it's called, or Imkan-e Nazir, as it's called. Can God produce a second Prophet Muhammad or not? Or the Mawlid, or other things, or what is the nature of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilmul ghaib. These are very sensitive issues. But notice how the pioneers of these schools, the Deoband school, the Barelvi school, and so on, engaged in very vociferous and sometimes very, very, hostile. Ahmed Raza Khan at one point even anathematized, called the Deoband pioneers non-Muslims in his famous fatwa of takfir that he did. So fine, it got to that point. But nonetheless, no shots were fired. This was an incredibly sophisticated, intense, very aggressive, very polemical debate. But nonetheless, it was very sophisticated as well. Nonetheless, it presented some very nuanced logics of the tradition as well. Both these scholars were referring to the same Hanafi canon, but in very nuanced ways. So I think there is a lesson for us that you can engage in very sensitive debates and issues without resorting to violence, without resorting to this kind of complete dismissal of the other. So I think that's what I would say, that in this book, there is a critique both of the liberal secular elite that completely dismisses religion altogether, and for some segments of the, I guess, the religious communities as well, or scholars as well, that this heritage and tradition is actually a great teaching moment for how to engage in serious, sensitive, intra-Muslim debates and to not shy away from them. And the final thing I would share on this question, and then we'll open it for Q&A, is that one of the tendencies that I've seen, especially in Pakistan, maybe to some extent in India as well, though India has a whole other kind of set of dynamics, which is that when it comes to intra-Muslim debates and polemics, to somehow just cover them, that no, let's not get into controversial stuff, let's just all be peaceful with each other, that we're all the same Muslims, we're all the same Sunni Muslims, or same whatever it might be, some kind of a narrative of peace to completely cover and completely hide any religious debates and differences. And what that does is that by hiding it, that by covering it, you basically make people more curious about it. And then if you don't have a good handle over the debates, you then open the way, you open the avenue for very sensationalized and very extremist interpretations of these debates. So not to shy away from polemics, not to cover them up, as some kind of sectarian, contributing to sectarian violence and so on. But that violence can be countered precisely by engaging and understanding these debates on their own terms, not by hiding them in the name of interreligious peace and harmony and so on. So that basically is what I would say in relation to why it should be read.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I was actually going to that part, the last part that you mentioned about this Pakistani context, but thank you, you already answered it. Right, Professor, this was the discussion. We'll move on to the Q&A.
Sure.
So there is one, so there's Muhammad Faizan. I'm going to pin you and you can ask your question. Yes, Faizan, you can ask your question from the professor.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
The question that I had, just one second, I'm just pulling it up. One of my friends actually asked this question and he wanted me to ask you specifically. He asks, is it possible to retain political theologies once the political order that animated them are lost? Namely, Badayuni-Barelvi aristocratic theologies in post-empire worlds.
Well, that's a really interesting question. How about we take a couple of questions each, and then I'll answer them in the interest of time. And I can go till 12:45, but what would be 9:45 in Pakistan.
Okay.
20 more minutes.
So, should I ask the second question as well?
Yeah, I'll just take 2 questions at a time, and that way we can answer more questions.
Right. Let me find if Irfan is here. Okay, so Irfan is here.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor. Thank you for the talk.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question on, so as far as the Deobandi ulama is concerned, you see their networks going from Kabul, Kandahar to Bengal.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm sort of curious as to what is their interaction with the history of Islam that comes from a place like South India. Because I know the sort of the genealogies, political histories, even legal histories from, if I can generalize, to South India is sort of different. So I'm curious as to what those interactions look like.
Great 2 questions. Yeah, so the first question of Faizan, there are 2 ways of addressing your question. And actually, your question, or your friend's question, is very connected to the second book, Perilous Intimacies, where the main question that I ask in that book is precisely that, the Islamic legal tradition, of course, is very diverse and has multiple positions when it comes to the whole question of interreligious friendship, Muslim, non-Muslim friendship, or Hindu-Muslim friendship. But nonetheless, the Islamic legal tradition in its classical period, when it talks about these issues, it assumes a political context of Muslim empire. That is the context in which these discourses are coming to the fore, are being composed. So my main question in Perilous Intimacies was that, in South Asia, from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century, as Muslim political sovereignty dwindles and is no longer there, how did Muslim scholars then engage with a legal tradition, a normative tradition, the very political context of which, that of Muslim imperial sovereignty, was no longer there? And you asked about the possibility of that. In some ways, there is a certain kind of impossibility because that tradition is informed precisely by a political context of Muslim imperial sovereignty. So in some ways, to completely then reenact it in a totally different set of political conditions is an impossible task. But the more interesting thing is not so much whether it is possible or impossible, as important of a question as it might be, but intellectually, I think a lot more interesting is to think about then how does sovereignty get talked about and how does sovereignty then get presented in these ulama discourses on interreligious friendship in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. And my main argument in the book is that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, increasingly Muslim scholars begin to situate, they begin to locate sovereign power, this power to decide, right? That's basically what sovereign power means, the power to decide, the power of decision. That sovereign power increasingly gets located by South Asian ulama in the domain of everyday ritual practices, everyday ritual life, in things like continuing cow sacrifice, for example, and not abandoning that for the sensitivity of the Hindus, or other kinds of ritual practices. And this is precisely why Hindu-Muslim intimacy in everyday ritual life, with things like Diwali, Holi, etc., Dussehra, becomes a problem of intensified critique for South Asian ulama. And on this point, interestingly, both the Deobandi and the Barelvi ulama have a lot of agreement and a lot in common. Maulana Ahmed Raza Khan, if you compare his thoughts on this whole question of Hindu-Muslim, intimacy in everyday ritual life, it's very similar to Ashraf Ali Thanvi or to other Deoband ulama. So on this point, they actually come together quite interestingly. But that basically would be my response to your question, that when the political context gets lost, sovereign power or the idea of sovereignty gets manifested in other domains of life, such as everyday ritual practices, or such as the institution of the caliphate for the Khilafat movement scholars, whom I also talk about quite a bit in the second book. And as to the second question of Irfan, that's a great question. A lot in several places in South India, the other thing which is very interesting and different from North India is that the Shafi law is practiced and followed, and it's not completely Hanafi. So that's the one major difference between Northern and Southern India on that question. And honestly, much research has not been done on these debates, the way they manifest in South India. And I think we need much more research on it. I'm not very aware of Deoband networks and how they manifest in South India and what kind of a comparison it would be between Northern and Southern India. So that's something I don't know much about, but I would think that the presence of Shafi law in South India would complicate that project quite a bit.
Right. First, there is just one last question. It's by Anam. Sorry?
Yeah, so someone's hand is also raised, maybe after that. Ashraf Saab. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to invite
Or
Maulana.
Anam, you can read out and we can take Anam and Ashraf.
Yeah, so Maulana Ashraf can ask his question, and then I will basically ask the question of Anam. Yes, Maulana.
Okay, fine.
Yes, firstly, I think, thank you very much, Professor, for very, very enlightening talk. I'm glad to see you in person after such a long time. Just to say that, I don't know what you think about it, but if you think about this, false dichotomy that you point out about the Sufi scholar and the legal scholar, and then, the form and the spirit, that type of dichotomy was, for me, broken a long time ago. If you think about 16th century scholars such as Sheikh Muhammad al-Fatani, who from the early inception, I think, based on people like Imam Ghazali and things that went in the century before, already, realized that dichotomy is not a real one, and one needs to break it. And then coming to people like Maulana, Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, rahmatullahi, Maulana Rashid Ahmed Gangohi, etc. How much of it was actually part of their training? Because, they had all studied under Maulana Mamluk Ali in Delhi, was very much grounded in the rational sciences. And so when they come to the debate, they already mastered ilmul munazara, all these type of things. They're already experts at it, and they use their background to bring that to the fore. The other thing is, if we consider Deobandiyat and Deobandism or Deobandiyat as it moves from Deoband to a place like South Africa, for example, people like Brandon Ingram have done extensive studies on the fact that the trans national movement, when it comes here, maybe in some expressions of Deobandiyat, it is in fact more conservative than the Deobandi school itself. I see this playing out on a daily basis in my own country, where you have an ultra-conservative form of Deobandism that maybe is not present in the seminary itself, So, what would you say to this type of development?
Yeah, let's take Anam's question as well, and I'll combine them.
Yeah, first of all, so this question is regarding so there's a subsection in the book, Prophetic Decisions and Desires, Prophecy, Sexuality, and Intimacy, and this is about Hazrat and the marriage. So she is asking about the way that it is framed. So she's asking that you've quoted David Powers only, and he's a Western author, and he has this. She says he has this Orientalist understanding of the story. So she's asking, why did you choose David Powers for this story?
Excellent. Sure, Maulana Ashraf, let me ask you a question first. I think your question raises 2 points. One is that one thing that we sometimes miss, especially sort of scholars outside of madrasa spaces in writing about these scholars or the ulama, is that the ulama did not live out their lives according to these disciplinary divisions according to which we now study them, the rationalists versus the traditionalists, or the Sufis and the legal scholars. All of these different traditions of the Muslim humanities, is what might call it, was an organic, embodied aspect of who they were. So it's not as if these scholars, in the morning were Sufi mystics and then became legal scholars in the afternoon, but this was one holistic part of who they are. And hence, when you look at them in these kinds of binary frameworks, that's the kind of violence you do. And that binary framework, in some ways, is indebted to a certain power of an Orientalist discourse on Islam, and especially on Sufism, as somehow the lesser stringent or the lesser rigid form of Islam, or the less Puritan form of Islam, or the kind of more exotic notion of Islam, or that which does not care as much about rituals and so on. And this is a very powerful kind of narrative that comes about in 19th century Orientalist writings to separate Sufism from Islam, basically, is what we see. I mean, even to this day, in some Western bookstores, you have different sections, Islam, and then you have New Age religion, and under that would be Sufism. So that kind of a 19th century Orientalist way of looking at Islam and its relationship with Sufism is something that then gets picked up by the secular elite within Muslim majority countries, including Pakistan. I mean, this is a very common notion. As you mentioned, anyone with a certain kind of Islam 101 would tell you that this is an untenable binary. But to this day, don't we, by we, I mean this in general, especially the case, I think, among a certain kind of a West-toxified or West-toxicated elite in Pakistan, is, provinces like Sindh are much more tolerant, etc., because they've had Sufi saints and peers over there. And, these kind of Arabized ulama come and they've made things all stringent and Puritan, or I am a moderate Muslim because I'm a Sufi Muslim. These bizarre kinds of things are talked about on a very daily basis. So then the question is, why this divide between, or this tremendous gulf between, sort of an obvious point that you cannot bifurcate the law from the Sharia, from Sufism, and this kind of a popular discourse. And I think the reason is, going back to Shershah's question earlier, is this complete absence of religious literacy. There is such an absence of this literacy among a certain kind of a liberal secular elite that it is not able to even realize the kind of buffoonery and clumsiness that it participates in on a very frequent basis, that then makes way towards English newspapers and these kind of different actors. I mean, in a country where a buffoon like Pervez Hoodboy is taken seriously by more than 10 people, it's something that really cries out for alarm. I mean, an absolute buffoon when it comes to questions of religion, but people listen to him. So that is, I think, very problematic, and that really punctuates the importance of some basic literacy in the language of religion and in Islam, so that this kind of buffoonery does not get the kind of center stage that it so frequently does. Now to another very interesting question. I think you're raising a very important point and a possible critique. So that section of the book was most interesting for me because of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi's interpretation of that moment in the Prophet's life. And this whole question of, if the Prophet did something that could have been controversial, marrying the ex-wife of Zayd ibn Haritha, marrying ex-wife of his adopted son, who later ceased to be his adopted son. If he did something controversial, why did he do that, knowing that this can create controversy? And Maulana Thanvi's, of course, response was that he did that as the project of religious reform, that people can then rethink this kind of taboo that existed on this whole idea. And there I was really interested in ways in which the humanity of the Prophet and the humanity and the kind of sort of moral questions that he was faced with as a prophet gets talked about by 19th century Muslim scholar or early 20th century Muslim scholar like Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi, and the kind of ambiguities involving his engagement with that question. And I will leave the details from here, since you've read that section of the book. And my invocation of David Powers was primarily because he's among the few scholars who has talked about that episode in some depth in his writings. So I had to engage with him because he's one of the very few scholars writing in English language who have talked about the Prophet's marriage in some kind of sustained fashion. So I was primarily using his resource as a reference point without authorizing or without validating everything that is written about early Islam as such. So it's not some kind of a comprehensive kind of endorsement of his method or his arguments, but on the specific question of the Prophet's marriage in this moment, I wanted to draw on him as a reference point because he's the main Western author who's written about it in English.
Right. These are, I guess, all the questions. Professor, you mentioned a bit about Dr. Kudbai. He was in my university yesterday. So he gave a session on education, and you can actually expect what he might have said on stage. Basically, the same old script of religion is bad and secular is good. But I have my teacher is here, Ma'am Shabana Gul. She's in the audience. And she asked him a very good question, not a question, but she gave a rebuttal in very quick words, and the whole crowd thought it. So it was very interesting. It was very recent that I just saw him in my university. But further, this is it. These are all the questions. I want to thank you for joining us. This was really a dream come true. I've been reading your work for almost like 1.5 years, and this was really helpful, this session. Thank you so much for joining.
No, thank you, Shersha. I mean, I really want to commend you and applaud you for this kind of reading that you're doing. It's incredible. I hope, inshallah, you get to go to graduate studies in Islamic studies at some point because you're so well read in this topic. And, I really, really want to thank everyone who's here. And as I said, this is the most important audience for me. People based in Pakistan, based in India and Kashmir, who are very, very interested in the question of Islam and religion, and frankly, who are doing something that is quite rare, which is to reflect on, read about, engage with this tradition in a manner which is neither turning this tradition into some kind of an abstract object of glorification, and nor is engaging in this kind of a liberal secular dismissal of the tradition either. And that middle space is a very important space that is not available as much anymore. So all of you are doing something really, really important. And I think this initiative of yours, Shersha, may God give you rewards for it, intellectually, politically, morally, and I would say devotionally. This is basically what a jihad for knowledge is all about. So I really want to commend you, and I hope this will be the beginning of much further conversations. And please feel free to get in touch, anyone. Again, you are my most important audience. For those based in the UK, I will be in the UK late June till the second week of July with a number of different engagements. And then, inshallah, Pakistan in the winter. So hope to see all of you in person as well. Assalamu alaikum.
Right. Professor,
you need to visit South Africa as well.
Inshallah, absolutely. My advisor, Ibrahim Musa, is South African, so I absolutely.
Yes, of course. Yeah, we know him very well. He's a good friend. Yeah.
Professor, you will be in Pakistan in January, December?
Yes, so basically in my winter break, that's what I do. I do places in the UK, Europe more in the summer, and then winter in Pakistan. So yes, late December, first 2 weeks of January, I should be in Pakistan. This time I hope to visit beyond just Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, inshallah, Peshawar as well. I will try my best. And the UK, someone is asking, Faizan here, yeah, I will be basically in Leeds and then the Bradford Literature Festival, and then a number of different engagements in London. And I will post it on my Twitter when the dates get settled. So be in touch. I would love to meet people.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much.
Right.